Gwinnett County Public Library presents Photography 101. With your library card, you will have access to free photography resources, including iMacs with Adobe Suite and DSLR and mirrorless cameras at our Learning Labs. Every other Wednesday, we will be covering the foundations of photography to get you started. Today, we will be covering exposure. As we discussed last time, all cameras work using the same basic principles. Digital cameras' buttons and knobs will continue to change over time, but the underpinnings of how cameras basically work and how to create an exposure will remain the same. So today, we'll go over everything you need to know about exposure and how to create one. Exposure can be explained as the quantity of light chosen to act on your camera's film or sensor. This quantity of light for the exposure is determined by three elements called the exposure triangle: ISO, how sensitive your film or sensor is to light; aperture, the size of the opening of your lens; and shutter speed, the duration of the exposure. This is all also determined by the light in the scene, and everything in the exposure triangle is all informed by light. Each of these principles also controls other aspects of how your final image will turn out, in addition to having an impact on the exposure. We are going to learn the basics of creating exposure first, then break apart each of these to learn more about what they do later. So if not everything makes sense at first, or you bump into an issue, keep pushing forward because there will be more to learn about each of these. The importance of light. In photography, light is everything. Photography is literally the method of recording permanent images by the action of light, projected onto film or other light-sensitive material like a digital sensor. So light is literally the raw material or medium of photography that is observed, harnessed, manipulated, or captured by the photographer. Always remember that light is what you are capturing and is affecting every exposure you are able to make. This is essential to understanding using your camera. So we're looking at a photograph here that doesn't look that impressive, but it is, because this photograph was made by Joseph Niepce in 1826, called View from the Window at Le Gras, and this is the first photograph to capture light and make its impression permanent. Now let's learn what each aspect of the exposure triangle is. First up is ISO. ISO is a number indicating how sensitive your camera's film or sensor is to light. As the number changes, it will completely change how sensitive your camera's sensor is to the light around it. Like your body, with or without sunburn, affects how sensitive you feel to light. Because of this, ISO should always be the first setting of the exposure triangle that you should set. To begin making an exposure, your camera needs to know how sensitive it's going to be to light, and that is what setting the ISO does. As the ISO number gets higher, the more sensitive to light the camera will be. So for example, ISO 200 is not very sensitive, while ISO 6400 is extremely sensitive to light. The standard ISO for normal shooting is between 100 and 400, meaning if you're shooting outside and have a good amount of light, shooting between 100 and 400 is a good idea. An ISO higher than 400, though, will start to lose quality. What I mean by that is that the image will start to have grain or noise. We'll talk about grain and noise more later, but for now, remember that as the ISO number gets higher, you will lose quality and your image will become grainy and noisy. This is an important reason why shooting on an auto setting isn't a good idea. Letting your camera select the ISO for you can lead to a lot of disappointment when it has selected a high ISO and ruined the quality of your photographs. The next arm of the exposure triangle is aperture. An aperture is the size of the opening of your lens. With a pinhole camera, the aperture would be the size of a pin. With your camera, the lens has f-stops, which control the size of the opening. On this chart, f2 is the largest opening, while f16 is the smallest. The higher the number is, the smaller the opening. So think of these as fractions, f over the number. Choosing the size of the opening will control the amount of light that is entering your camera. So the bigger the aperture opening, the more light enters through the lens, and the smaller the aperture opening, the less light enters through the lens. Last is shutter speed. Shutter speed is the time that the shutter of the camera is open and exposing to light. And this is measured in seconds and fractions of a second. Here we can see a chart with shutter speeds from 1,000th of a second to 1 full second. We can see that the longer the shutter is open, the more light will be entering the camera through the shutter curtain. The faster the shutter is open, the less light will be entering the camera through the shutter curtain. Let's take a moment to talk about what stops are. Apertures and shutter speeds are measured in stops. A stop is a relative measure of light. So it's the unit that exposure is measured in. Like how inches measures distance, stops measures light. Every time you move your aperture or shutter speed up or down, you're moving 1 stop, 2 stops, etc. 1 full stop is letting double or half as much light into the camera. So for example, if you move your aperture from f2.8 to f4, you moved 1 stop and let in half as much light because the aperture is getting 1 stop smaller. Then if you move your shutter from 1/250th of a second to 1/60th, you move 2 stops, which lets in 4 times as much light because that shutter is 2 stops slower. If you're shooting digitally, you'll likely be able to move in half or quarter stops, so keep this in mind. All the numbers listed here in the lecture are full stops. Now let's take a look at how our apertures and shutter speeds look in action on a camera in these next 2 videos. So now we're going to take a look at our shutter speeds on our camera. So here we're looking inside of a film camera, and we're looking directly into our shutter curtain. So if we were shooting film, we would pull our film across here, and an exposure would be created behind the shutter curtain and then pushed forward to make room for the next one. On a digital camera, your sensor will be in that same location right behind our shutter curtain, but it'll look exactly the same. Whether your shutter curtain is inside of a film or a digital camera, it'll look the same in there. So now we're going to listen to our shutter speeds, and we're going to start at the fastest and work our way to slow shutter speeds. That shutter speed had a distinctly different sound to it because we just entered our slower shutter speeds. Let's hear it again. That was a 15th of a second, and we're hearing a lag in the opening and closing of our shutter speed. So a 15th of a second is the last shutter speed that we can handhold our camera. Because once you start to hear a lag, your breath, the heartbeat in your hands, your hand shaking will start to create camera shake in our image. So a 15th of a second is when that lag starts to appear. And if we really hold our breath and try to hold ourselves very still, we can handhold at a 15th of a second. Or this is the first shutter speed that we should start putting our camera on a tripod. So now let's listen to the slower shutter speeds after a 15th. Now let's take a look at apertures. So I'm going to open up my shutter curtain, and then we'll be able to see through the barrel of the lens and through our aperture opening. Okay, so here we're looking at f2. This is the biggest or widest aperture opening that I have available on this lens. Okay, stopped it down once, so you'll see that I have made the aperture opening smaller, and I have let in half as much light. I moved it one stop and let in half as much light. Move one stop, let in now half as much light again. One stop, half as much light. 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 Okay, so now I am on my smallest f-stop, which is 22. I'm letting in the least amount of light when I have my smallest opening. And as I make my aperture opening larger, I will be letting more light in through my lens. So smaller number, bigger opening and more light. Bigger number, smaller opening and less light. Okay, back to the exposure triangle. Aperture and shutter speed always work together to decide how much light reaches the camera's film or sensor when you're making an exposure. Whenever you change the aperture, the shutter speed must also be adjusted because they affect each other. Here we can see that as we make our aperture smaller, less light will be entering the camera through the aperture. So the shutter speed needs to be slower to let that smaller amount of light in for a longer amount of time. And vice versa. As the aperture is bigger, more light will be coming in through the aperture opening, and so the shutter speed needs to be faster to let that light in for a shorter amount of time. Here we are seeing 3 exposure pairs that are letting in the same amount of light. From the first to second image, we've changed our shutter speed to be 1 stop faster, from a 30th of a second to a 60th. So we let in half as much light through the shutter because it's going 1 stop faster. This means we need to double the amount of light coming through the aperture opening to create the same exposure of light. So we've changed the aperture from f16 to f11, 1 full stop bigger, and so double the amount of light is coming in through the lens to compensate for half the amount of light from our shutter. So these 2 pairs, f16 with a shutter of a 30th and f11 with a shutter of a 60th, are letting in the same amount of light as one another, but are creating different effects to the motion in the scene that we'll learn more about later. The same is true if we move the shutter to be 1 stop faster to 1/25th of a second. This is letting in half as much light, so we need to double the light again by opening the aperture 1 more stop to f8. Now we changed our shutter to be 4 times as fast as the first image, letting in less light, and our f-stop to let in 4 times as much light because aperture and shutter speed affect each other and come in pairs. So all 3 of these exposures are letting in the same amount of light, just with different settings. This is called equivalent exposures. Aperture and shutter speeds come in pairs. You need one paired with the other to create the exposure, and many pairs let in the same amount of light. So if your exposure is f2 at 1/500th of a second, and you want to change your aperture to f16, you'll be moving your aperture 6 stops. So you would want to compensate for the aperture letting in 6 stops less light by adding 6 stops of light through the shutter, or to 1/8. So how do we decide what settings to use to create an exposure? There is no such thing as a good shutter or aperture in general, only the correct one for a certain scene you're photographing. So for that, we must use our camera's built-in light meter, which reads how much light is in the scene and then tells you what aperture or shutter speed to shoot at. So this is determined by the light in the scene, and there are 2 types of light: incident and reflective. Incident light is the light coming straight down from the source. When it reaches objects, it'll bounce off and turn into reflected light. Reflected light is the light that enters your camera. So reflected light enters your lens and camera, allowing your light meter to read it. So your camera will make this reading based off of the ISO you selected before you started shooting, like ISO 200, and then set on your camera's body before beginning to shoot. How your light meter will look will depend on the camera you have, but all light meters will have the same basic parts that tell you the same thing: when it thinks you have the correct exposure for the light in the scene. Here is what most digital light meters look like. And our goal is to get your meter to look like that first line, with a solid dash in the center at 0, meaning you're letting in just the right amount of light. If there are dashes in the plus direction to the right, too much light is entering your camera, and the light meter thinks you should take light away. If there are dashes in the negative direction to the left, not enough light is entering your camera, and the light meter thinks you should add light. The moment of exposure. Most of the time, the inside of your camera is totally dark. When you push down the shutter button to take a photograph, the camera shutter opens, light from the outside floods in through the lens's aperture opening, through the open shutter curtain, and is projected onto the film or sensor to make the exposure. When too much light exposes, it'll make the image washed out and bright, which is called overexposure. I'm overwhelmed with how the image looks. It's overexposed. The image overall will be too bright, the highlights will be blown out, and there'll be no shadows. This means that too much light is entering our camera, so we need to make our aperture smaller or our shutter speed shorter to let less light in. When not enough light exposes, the photograph will be too dark, which means the image is underexposed. I'm underwhelmed with how the image looks. It's underexposed. The image will look overall too dark. There will be no highlights and the shadows will be too dark or blocked up. This means not enough light is entering our camera, so we need to make the aperture bigger or the shutter speed longer to get more light in. When we have the correct exposure, we are letting in the right amount of light. A good exposure depends on calculating the correct aperture and shutter speed pair that will let in the right amount of light for the scene being photographed. So this is about measuring and balancing the light in the scene. How a correct exposure appears will depend on the actual scene being photographed, but typically we'll have highlights that are bright but not blown out, shadows that are dark but not blocked up, and a range of midtones in between. A good technical exposure will produce a final image that accurately represents the original scene by balancing the light. So notice in this image by Ansel Adams that the highlights are bright but not overexposed, the shadows are dark but still contain detail, and there is a range of midtones in between. Thank you for joining us for Photography 101. To book an appointment to use our learning labs and photography equipment, go to gwinnettpl.org/meeting rooms. Please leave your questions in the comments or contact us at learninglabs@gwinnettpl.org. And be sure to tune in every other Wednesday for new photography tutorials.